The scent of burnt coffee and fried food clung to the damp morning air as Emma Carter adjusted the thin strap of her worn-out backpack. The February wind bit through her coat, slipping under the fabric like a thief in the night. Her sneakers slapped against the cracked sidewalk as she hurried toward the bus stop. Another long day awaited her, one filled with exhaustion, minimum wage shifts, and the lingering fear that any moment her world could collapse. She checked her phone. 6:32 a.m. The bus would arrive in 3 minutes, just enough time for her to catch her breath. She exhaled sharply, pulling her coat tighter around herself as she shifted her weight from one foot to another. A group of college students stood a few feet away, laughing and talking about last night's party. Emma looked away. Their world was different from hers. She wasn't like them. She didn't have the luxury of late-night drinking or carefree mornings. At 22, her life had already been carved into survival and sacrifice. She was a medical student at New York University, the first in her family to go to college. But what should have been an exciting milestone felt more like a burden. Juggling textbooks and stethoscopes by day, waiting tables by night, it was a relentless cycle that left her drowning in exhaustion. And the money? There was never enough of it. The tiny apartment in Brooklyn she shared with her mother and siblings was falling apart. The landlord had given them 2 weeks before he would change the locks. Her mother, Linda, once strong and vibrant, was now battling diabetes, her body weakening with each passing day. The hospital bills were a mountain Emma couldn't climb, no matter how many hours she worked. Her younger brother, Jake, was only 13, but already walking the dangerous line between trouble and desperation. Expelled from school last month for fighting, he had started hanging out with the wrong crowd. Emma wanted to save him before it was too late, but how could she when she barely had time to breathe? And then, there was Lily, her 7-year-old sister, the only bright light in Emma's world. Innocent, smart, hopeful. But hope didn't pay the rent. Hope didn't buy insulin for their mother. Hope didn't put food on the table. The bus pulled up, its brakes hissing as the doors creaked open. Emma climbed in, swiping her Metro card with mechanical precision before sinking into a seat by the window. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching the city blur past. Today would be the same as yesterday, the same as the day before, and the same as tomorrow. A never-ending cycle of struggle, where dreams were a luxury she couldn't afford. And yet, as the bus carried her toward another grueling shift at the diner, she had no idea that within a week her life would take a turn she never could have imagined. A turn that would place her inside the gilded walls of a billionaire's mansion. A turn that would force her to make an impossible choice, and a turn that would rewrite her entire future. The diner was suffocating. The air smelled of grease, stale coffee, and cheap perfume. The flickering neon sign outside cast an eerie glow through the windows, bouncing off the cracked linoleum floor. Emma Carter wiped the sweat from her brow, forcing herself to smile as she balanced a tray of steaming plates. Her hands ached, her back throbbed, and her feet felt like they had been glued to the floor for hours. Because they had. Her shift was supposed to end an hour ago, but her manager had begged her to stay. Double shifts meant extra money, and extra money meant she could buy insulin for her mother instead of skipping another meal to afford it. She set the plates down in front of a couple who didn't even look at her before continuing their conversation. One more table, just one more, and then I can go home. But then it happened. "Excuse me," a shrill voice cut through the noise. Emma turned to see a middle-aged woman with platinum blonde hair and too much lipstick, waving her down like she was some kind of servant. "Yes, ma'am?" Emma asked, keeping her voice steady. The woman sneered. I asked for no pickles? What is this? She pushed her plate toward Emma as if it were poisoned. Emma blinked. Oh, I'm so sorry, I can. Are you even listening? God, people like you? You should be grateful you even have a job. Emma's chest tightened. People like you. She knew exactly what that meant. Poor, struggling, worthless. Her hands clenched into fists, but she forced herself to remain calm. She couldn't lose this job. I'll get that fixed right away, she murmured, reaching for the plate. But the woman wasn't done. You probably dropped out of high school, didn't you? I can always tell. The words cut deeper than they should have. Emma was in college. She was working her ass off to become a doctor. But to this woman, she was nothing more than a waitress who was too stupid to take an order correctly. Her breath hitched, and before she knew it, her vision blurred. Not here. Not now. Emma whirled around and ran into the restroom, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She locked the stall behind her, pressing her hands against the cool metal as the tears finally spilled over. She hated this. She hated this life. The exhaustion, the hunger, the never-ending cycle of misery. Was this it? Was this all her life would ever be? She bit her lip hard enough to draw blood. Number. She had promised herself she would find a way out. Somehow. And fate, it seemed, had been listening. When Emma finally left the diner that night, the streets were slick with rain, the pavement glistening under the glow of streetlights. She pulled her coat tighter, shivering as she trudged toward the bus stop. But before she could take another step, a deep voice stopped her cold. Emma! She froze. Slowly, she turned to see a man standing under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. Robert Walker, her uncle. A man she hadn't seen in almost a year. A man who only ever showed up when he wanted something. Emma's grip tightened around her bag. What are you doing here? Robert took a slow step forward, his heavy boots splashing through a puddle. His face was worn, his hair grayer than she remembered. I heard about your mother, he said gruffly. Emma's stomach twisted. She's fine, she lied. Robert gave her a long look, then sighed. Look, kid, I know things are rough. That's why I came. Emma scoffed. Yeah? Since when do you care? Robert's jaw tightened. But instead of arguing, he reached into his coat and pulled out a business card. She frowned. What's this? Robert hesitated. Then, in a voice lower than before, he said, A way out. Emma stared at him. What are you talking about? Robert exhaled slowly, glancing around before lowering his voice further. There's a man, he said. William Harrington. A billionaire. Old, sick, no family. Emma's heart skipped a beat. He needs a wife, Robert continued. A legal wife. No romance, no strings attached, just a contract. In exchange, he'll take care of you and your family. Medical bills, rent, everything. Emma's blood ran cold. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. What? She whispered. Robert's face was unreadable. It's simple. You marry him. You get the money. When he dies, you get a part of his fortune. You walk away set for life. Emma stumbled backward, as if he had slapped her. This had to be a joke. You're joking, right? She managed to say. Robert shook his head. Her heart pounded. You want me to marry some rich old man? For money? Robert's expression didn't change. Yes. Emma laughed bitterly, shaking her head. You're insane. That's disgusting. I'd rather die. Robert's eyes darkened. Would you? He asked quietly. Emma's breath hitched. Because last I checked, he continued, your mom is running out of insulin. Your landlord's ready to kick you out. And your little brother. He's one fight away from being locked up. So tell me, Emma, what's your plan? Silence. The words hit her like a train. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Because she didn't have a plan. She had nothing. Robert took a step closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "This is your way out, kid," he said. "It's 1 year. 1 year. And you'll never have to struggle again." Emma's chest tightened. Number. This was wrong. It was immoral. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down, her fingers trembling as she pulled it out. A text from Jake. Mom collapsed. Ambulance is coming. Emma's vision blurred, her world tilted. And in that moment, she knew. She didn't have a choice. Her hands shook as she looked back up at Robert. "When do I meet him?" The car was silent. Emma sat in the back seat of a sleek black Rolls-Royce, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater as the city lights flickered past. The ride from Brooklyn to the Upper East Side felt like a journey between two worlds. The crumbling brick buildings of her neighborhood had given way to towering glass structures, pristine sidewalks, and streets that smelled of expensive cologne and privilege. Her uncle Robert sat beside her, staring straight ahead. "You don't have to do this," he muttered. Emma gritted her teeth. "Yes, I do." Robert didn't argue. He just sighed and turned his gaze back to the road. Emma clenched her fists in her lap. 1 year. That was all she had to survive. 1 year of a cold, loveless marriage. 1 year of living in his world. And then she could walk away. But no matter how many times she repeated it, her stomach twisted into knots. The car slowed, then stopped in front of a wrought iron gate, so massive it looked like it belonged to a castle. Beyond it stood a mansion straight out of a dream or a nightmare. It was enormous, stretching across acres of perfectly manicured land. Ivy crawled up the gray stone walls, wrapping around arched windows and towering columns. Golden lights glowed behind silk curtains, illuminating a world Emma knew she didn't belong to. The gate creaked open, and the car pulled into the driveway. The sheer grandeur of it made Emma's throat tighten. "Last chance," Robert said. Emma ignored him and opened the door. The moment she stepped out, the cold air wrapped around her like a warning. A butler in a crisp black suit stood waiting at the entrance. "Miss Carter," he said, bowing slightly. "Mr. Harrington is expecting you." Emma swallowed hard. This was it. Taking a deep breath, she followed him inside. The interior of the mansion was even more intimidating than the outside. The marble floors gleamed under a chandelier, the sign of her entire apartment. Every surface screamed money, from the gold-trimmed mirrors to the oil paintings that looked older than the United States itself. But it wasn't the luxury that made her uneasy. It was the silence. This house wasn't alive. It was a museum, frozen in time. "Right this way," the butler said, leading her down a long hallway. With every step, her heartbeat pounded harder. Then, the butler stopped in front of a set of heavy wooden doors. He knocked twice. "Come in," a deep voice called. The butler pushed the doors open, revealing a vast study lined with bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. A fire crackled in the grand fireplace, casting long shadows across the room. And there, sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, was William Harrington. Emma froze. She had expected an old, frail man, someone clinging to the last days of his life. But William was different. He was older, yes, 65 at least. But he wasn't weak. His posture was perfect, his silver hair neatly combed back. He wore a tailored black suit that fit his lean frame effortlessly. And his eyes, icy blue, sharp as glass, cut straight through her. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice smooth but distant. Emma swallowed, forcing herself to step inside. "Mr. Harrington," she said. He studied her, his expression unreadable. "You're younger than I expected," he murmured. Emma stiffened. "Should I take that as a compliment?" One of his eyebrows arched slightly, not in amusement, but in mild interest. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Emma hesitated before lowering herself into it. The silence stretched between them. Then, finally, William leaned back, folding his hands in front of him. "I assume Robert explained the terms of our arrangement?" Emma nodded slowly. "No romance," she recited. "No physical relationship. Just a legal contract." William's lips pressed into a thin line. "You will live here," he continued. "You will attend public events with me when necessary. You will follow the expectations placed upon you as my wife. In return, your family will be provided for." His voice was emotionless, like he was discussing a business deal, not a marriage. Emma's stomach twisted, but she kept her expression blank. "And when you die?" she asked. William tilted his head slightly. "You'll receive a portion of my estate," he said. "Enough to ensure you never have to work again." Emma's fingers curled into her lap. It sounded simple, too simple. But something about the way he spoke made her uneasy. "Why me?" she asked finally. William paused, his sharp gaze pinning her in place. Then, in a voice softer than before, he said, "You remind me of someone." Emma blinked. Before she could ask who, he slid a folder across the desk. "This contains the contract," he said. "Review it. If you agree, we'll proceed with the marriage immediately." Emma hesitated. She could still walk away. She could get up, leave this house, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But then she thought of her mother in a hospital bed, of her little brother sleeping in a freezing apartment, of her sister whispering, "It's okay, Emma. I don't need dinner tonight." Her throat tightened. She didn't have a choice. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the folder. The contract was thick. Pages and pages of rules, conditions and clauses. And at the very bottom, a signature line. William placed a gold pen beside it. Emma stared at it, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she picked up the pen and signed her name. The ink bled across the page, sealing her fate. William took the contract, glancing over her signature, before setting it aside. "Good," he said, standing. Emma stood too, her legs feeling like they might give out beneath her. "We'll be married at City Hall tomorrow," he said, already walking toward the door. "Pack your things. You'll be moving in immediately." Emma felt like she was drowning. This was happening too fast, too real. "Do you tell people," she asked, "that it's just an arrangement?" William paused, then turned to look at her. His expression was unreadable. "No," he said. "As far as the world is concerned, we are a happily married couple." Emma shivered. The words felt like a sentence, but it was too late to back out now. William inclined his head slightly, his blue eyes piercing. "Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Harrington." Emma's breath caught, and with that, he walked out, leaving her alone in the grand, empty room. Her hands trembled at her sides, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she had made the right choice. The courthouse was eerily silent. Emma stood before the judge, dressed in a simple white dress, not a wedding gown, just a dress. There were no flowers, no music, no guests, only her, William, and two lawyers. The air was thick with formality, nothing like the warm and joyous weddings she had dreamed of as a little girl. The judge read through the vows in a monotone voice, and William responded without hesitation. Emma tried to steady her breathing. When it was her turn, she swallowed hard. "I do." The words left her lips, but they didn't feel like her own. William slid a plain gold band onto her finger. Elegant, expensive, but devoid of sentiment. She barely had time to register its weight before the judge announced, "You may kiss the bride." Emma stiffened, but William didn't move. Instead, he turned to the judge and said, "That won't be necessary." The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Harrington." Emma felt cold. Her entire life had changed in less than 10 minutes, and yet it felt like nothing had changed at all. The drive back to the Harrington estate was just as silent as before, but this time, Emma wasn't just a visitor. She was his wife. The thought made her stomach churn. As the car pulled up to the towering mansion, the front doors swung open. A line of staff members stood at attention, their expressions neutral, professional, waiting for her. The butler, Mr. Collins, stepped forward first. His face betrayed nothing. "Welcome home, Mrs. Harrington." The words didn't feel real. Emma nodded stiffly and followed William inside. The moment she stepped in, the weight of her new life crashed down on her. The Harrington estate was breathtaking. Everything, from the gleaming chandeliers to the spiral staircases, spoke of wealth and power. But it lacked warmth. This was not a home. It was a monument, a place where people came to admire, but never to stay. And now, it was hers. She wasn't sure if that was a gift or a curse. As she followed William up the stairs, he finally spoke. "You will have your own room," he said. "The third floor, last door on the right." Emma frowned. "Aren't married couples supposed to share a room?" William stopped at the top of the staircase. "We're not a normal couple," he said, his tone final. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into his wing of the house. Emma let out a shaky breath. So that was it. She was a wife on paper, but in every other way, she was still alone. The next morning, Emma woke to the sound of soft knocking. She blinked, momentarily disoriented. The canopy bed, the silk sheets, the high ceiling, it all felt foreign. Then reality slammed into her. She wasn't in Brooklyn anymore. She was in his house, his world. Taking a deep breath, she called, "Come in." The door opened, revealing a woman in her 60s, dressed in a perfectly pressed uniform. Her gray hair was pinned into a neat bun, and her sharp eyes studied Emma with mild curiosity. "I'm Mrs. Porter," she said, her voice clipped but not unkind. "I manage the household staff." Emma sat up. "It's nice to meet you." Mrs. Porter didn't smile, but her gaze softened. "If you need anything, let me know," she said. "Breakfast is served at 8. Mr. Harrington is very particular about meal times." Emma nodded. But as Mrs. Porter turned to leave, something in her expression shifted. A flicker of hesitation, almost like a warning. "If I may, Mrs. Harrington," she said slowly. Emma sat up straighter. "Yes?" Mrs. Porter's lips pressed together. "This house—" She paused, searching for the right words. "It has its secrets." Emma's pulse quickened, but before she could ask anything, Mrs. Porter bowed her head slightly and left. Emma stared after her. Secrets? She didn't know why, but a chill ran down her spine. That evening, as Emma wandered the halls, she stumbled upon a locked door. It was different from the others. The wood was darker, the brass handle polished, but untouched. Something about it felt forbidden. She tried the knob. Locked. Frowning, she turned to find Mr. Collins watching her from the end of the hall. His face was unreadable. "That room is off limits," he said. Emma's heart pounded. She knew better than to pry. But something inside her whispered, "What is William hiding?" That night, Emma sat across from William at a massive dining table meant for 20 people. It was just the two of them. The silence was suffocating. Emma pushed her food around her plate, waiting for him to say something, but he didn't. He ate in silence, his posture perfect, his gaze fixed on his plate. Finally, Emma couldn't take it. "So," she started, "what do we tell people?" William looked up. She hesitated, then added, "About us." His expression was unreadable. "What about us?" Emma clenched her fists. "What happens when people ask? Should I pretend we're in love?" William's jaw tightened. "You don't have to pretend," he said. "You only have to play your role." Emma felt her stomach twist. Play her role. That's all she was to him. A role to be played, a piece on a chessboard. She swallowed hard. "I understand." William studied her for a long moment. Then, without another word, he stood and left the table. Emma exhaled shakily. Her appetite was gone. She was beginning to realize something. She had married a ghost, not in the literal sense. But William Harrington was not a man who lived in the present. He was haunted. By what? Emma didn't know. But she intended to find out, even if it meant unraveling every secret this house held. Later that night, Emma wandered into the music room. A grand piano sat in the center, its black surface gleaming under the chandelier. She hesitated, then ran her fingers lightly over the keys. A soft melody filled the air. "You play." Emma gasped, turning sharply. William stood in the doorway, his blue eyes unreadable. "Not very well," she admitted. He stepped inside, watching as she played a few more hesitant notes. Then, for the first time, his expression softened. "You remind me of someone," he murmured. Emma's fingers froze on the keys. There it was again. That whisper of a past he refused to talk about. And in that moment, Emma knew. William Harrington's secrets ran deeper than she ever imagined. The mansion had a strange way of swallowing sound. Even when Emma moved through the halls, her footsteps barely echoed. It was as if the house itself had trained to keep secrets. She had been living in the estate for a week now, and yet it still didn't feel like home. William was always distant, their conversations minimal. He was polite, but never warm. He would spend most of his time in his study, locked away with his thoughts. Mrs. Porter was kind in her own way, but kept her distance. Mr. Collins, the butler, was almost robotic in his efficiency. The only person who truly treated her like a human being was Eleanor, the chef. "Eat something, dear," Eleanor told her one evening, sliding a bowl of warm soup in front of her. Emma smiled, grateful for the small kindness. "Thank you, Eleanor." The older woman studied her. "You seem troubled." Emma hesitated. Should she say something? "Has William always been like this?" she finally asked. Eleanor sighed, shaking her head. "He wasn't always so cold, dear. There was a time when he was full of life." Emma leaned forward. "What happened?" Eleanor hesitated. Then, with a glance around the room, as if checking for prying ears, she said, "That's not my story to tell." Emma's frustration burned. Why was everyone keeping secrets? She needed to know the truth. That night, sleep did not come easily. Emma lay in her massive bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning. The locked door, the hushed whispers, William's haunted eyes, everything pointed to something deeper. At midnight, she finally gave in to her curiosity. She slipped out of bed, pulling on a sweater, and crept down the hallway. If she wanted answers, she had to find them herself. She made her way to the library. The room was massive, lined with towering bookshelves that smelled of old paper and history. Her fingers brushed against the spines, trailing along the rows, when she saw it. A framed photograph, tucked into a shelf, hidden behind a row of books. Emma pulled it out. It was a black and white picture of William, much younger, standing beside a beautiful woman. She had soft curls, kind eyes, and a radiant smile. The way William looked at her in the photo was nothing like the way he looked at Emma. This woman had meant everything to him. Who was she? Before Emma could process the thought, a voice cut through the darkness. "What are you doing?" She turned sharply. William stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were filled with anger. Emma felt her throat go dry. I couldn't sleep," she said, gripping the photograph. William stepped forward. His presence filled the room. "Why are you touching my things?" Emma swallowed hard. "Who is she?" His jaw clenched. "That is none of your concern." Emma met his gaze. "I think it is." Silence stretched between them. For the first time, William looked unsettled. Finally, he exhaled. Her name was Eleanor. Emma's breath hitched. "Eleanor? Not the chef Eleanor. Another Eleanor." "My fiancée," he admitted. "Many years ago." Emma froze. "Fiancée," she repeated. William nodded. "She left me." Emma felt a pang of something she didn't understand. "She left you?" she asked softly. "Why?" William's eyes darkened. "That's none of your business," he said coldly. Emma stared at him. "Why do you keep everything locked away?" she whispered. His jaw tightened. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the library, leaving Emma standing in the dim glow of the chandeliers, the photograph still clutched in her hands. The next morning, Emma couldn't get Eleanor's name out of her head. Not the Eleanor in the kitchen, but the Eleanor in the photograph. William had been engaged before, and yet he never spoke of her. Why? Why was her memory buried in the depths of the house, hidden behind locked doors and cold stairs? Emma knew she couldn't ask William. He wouldn't tell her. So instead, she turned to the only person who might, Mrs. Porter. Emma found the housekeeper in the sunlit sitting room, carefully dusting an old cabinet. "Mrs. Porter," Emma began, her voice careful. The older woman looked up. Emma hesitated, then held up the photograph. "Who is she?" Mrs. Porter stilled. Her face paled slightly, but she took the photograph, running a hand over it, as if she were holding a ghost. After a long silence, she sighed. "I thought he burned all of these," she murmured. Emma's pulse quickened. "Tell me," she pressed. Mrs. Porter hesitated. Then she caved. "Eleanor was the love of his life," she admitted. Emma exhaled. "She left him?" Mrs. Porter met Emma's gaze. "No," she said quietly. Emma's heart stopped. "She didn't leave him." Emma's stomach twisted. "Then what happened?" Mrs. Porter's voice was barely above a whisper. "She disappeared." Emma's blood ran cold. "Disappeared?" she repeated. Mrs. Porter nodded slowly. "One night, she was here. The next morning, she was gone." Emma gripped the armrest of the chair. Did William have anything to do with it?" she asked, hesitant. Mrs. Porter shook her head firmly. "He loved her more than anything in this world." Emma's pulse pounded. "But he never spoke about her again." Emma felt a chill creep up her spine. Where did Eleanor go? And why did William bury her memory so deeply? Emma knew one thing for sure. She had to find out the truth, even if William didn't want her to. The mansion felt different now. The air was thicker, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier. Emma couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Porter had told her. Eleanor didn't leave. She disappeared. And William? He buried the truth like a body in the ground. Emma wasn't sure what was more unsettling, the fact that Eleanor had vanished without a trace, or the way William had locked her memory away, refusing to speak of it. She had to know more. So that night, Emma made a decision. She was going to find out what happened, even if it meant breaking the mansion's unspoken rule: stay out of William's study. It was nearly midnight when Emma finally mustered the courage. She crept down the grand hallway, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The study door loomed ahead, tall and ominous. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, listening for any sounds. Nothing. Holding her breath, she reached for the doorknob. It was locked. Emma swallowed. Of course it was. She turned, her mind racing. There had to be a way in. Then, her eyes landed on something. The keys. They hung on a hook near the butler's office. Emma bit her lip, hesitating. Was this crossing the line? She thought of Eleanor, of William's grief, buried under layers of ice. She thought of the photograph hidden behind books, of Mrs. Porter's whispered words. One night, she was here. The next morning, she was gone. Emma grabbed the keys. She was done being afraid. The lock clicked softly. Emma pushed the door open, stepping inside. The study was immaculate, as if frozen in time. Dark wood shelves, leather chairs, a massive desk. The air smelled of old books, whiskey, and something faintly unfamiliar. Like time itself had settled here, undisturbed. Emma's eyes scanned the room. She moved carefully, searching for something, anything, that could tell her more about Eleanor. Then, her eyes landed on the drawer. It was locked. Her pulse spiked. What was in there? Emma searched the desk, feeling along the edges, until her fingers brushed against something. A small key, hidden beneath a stack of papers. Her hands shook as she slid it into the lock. Click. The drawer slid open. Inside, there was a stack of letters. At the very top, one letter, addressed in delicate handwriting. To William Harrington. Emma's fingers trembled as she picked it up. She unfolded the paper, her breath catching in her throat as she read. My dearest William, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Not by choice. I am in danger, William, and I fear that if I tell you, you will try to stop it. You always tried to save me, but this time, I cannot be saved. They will not let me go. They will not let us be happy. I have no choice but to leave before they take me. But know this, I never stopped loving you. No matter what you hear, no matter what they tell you, I did not leave you. I was taken. I pray that one day you will find the truth. Always yours, Eleanor. Emma's heart pounded. Taken? Who was they? What had happened to Eleanor? Emma read the letter again and again, her mind racing. Had William ever read this? Or had it been buried in this drawer, untouched, unread, forgotten? Before she could process what to do next, a voice cut through the darkness. What are you doing? Emma spun around. William stood in the doorway. His eyes were dark, his face stone cold. And in his hand, he held the letter. Emma's body went rigid. She hadn't even heard him enter the room. William took a slow step forward, his eyes locked on the letter in her hands. What are you doing? His voice was low, controlled, but barely. Emma swallowed hard. She wanted to lie, but she couldn't. I was looking for answers, she whispered. His jaw tightened. By invading my study? His voice rose slightly. Emma forced herself to stand her ground. You never talk about her, she said, gripping the letter. You pretend she never existed. William snatched the letter from her hands. This is none of your concern, he snapped. Emma's breath shook. She was taken, William. She didn't leave you. William's face twisted, with something she couldn't place, something between rage, grief, and deep, deep pain. You think I don't know that? Emma stilled. He knew? William turned away, running a shaky hand through his hair. Then, in a voice so quiet, It almost wasn't there. I've known for years. Emma's stomach dropped. You knew she was taken? William closed his eyes. When she disappeared, I searched for her, he murmured. For months, years. Emma felt a pang in her chest. What happened? She whispered. William's shoulders stiffened. I found nothing, he said. His voice, so cold, so bitter, sent a chill down Emma's spine. They covered their tracks too well. Emma's mind raced. Who were they? And if William knew Eleanor had been taken, why had he given up? William turned to Emma, his eyes shining with something raw. And what do you think you're going to do, Emma? She froze. You think you'll succeed where I failed? He asked. Emma straightened her spine. I don't know, she said honestly. But I do know one thing. She stepped forward, looking him in the eye. I'm not going to pretend like she never existed. Silence. A long, tense silence. Then, William let out a slow, tired breath. And without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Emma alone, the letter clutched in her shaking hands. Emma sat awake for hours, staring at the letter, rereading every word. And as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, she made her choice. She was going to find out what happened to Eleanor, no matter what it took, even if it meant digging into a past that someone clearly wanted buried. Because one thing was certain, Eleanor's story was not over, and neither was hers. Emma couldn't sleep. The letter felt like it was burning in her hands. Every word echoed in her mind. Eleanor had been taken. Someone had wanted her gone, and William had stopped looking. Why? Why had he given up? And if Eleanor had a child, what had happened to him? Emma sat in her room, staring at the letter under the dim glow of her bedside lamp. She knew what she had to do. Find the truth, even if it meant going against William, even if it meant risking everything. She took a deep breath. Tomorrow, she would start investigating. The next morning, Emma sat at the kitchen table, pushing her untouched coffee around with a spoon. She needed help. Someone who knew how to dig deeper than she could. And there was only one person she could think of. Daniel Brooks. He was an ex-police detective, turned private investigator. She had met him once, when he came to the diner where she worked, helping a woman find her missing husband. Emma pulled out her phone and dialed his number. It rang twice before a rough, skeptical voice answered. Who's this? Mr. Brooks? Emma said, her voice slightly shaky. Emma, my name is Emma Carter. I need your help. There was a pause. I don't take cases from strangers. Emma gritted her teeth. This isn't just any case, she pressed. It's about William Harrington. Another pause. Then a low chuckle. The billionaire? He said. You got my attention. What's this about? Emma exhaled slowly. I need to find someone, she said. A woman who went missing over 40 years ago. And her son. Another silence. Finally, Brooks sighed. Meet me at Joe's diner in an hour. Click. Emma stared at her phone. This was it. Joe's diner was a small, dimly lit place, tucked between two apartment buildings in Brooklyn. When Emma walked in, she immediately spotted Brooks sitting in the back booth. He was in his mid-40s, gruff and unshaven, with sharp eyes that had seen too much. Emma slid into the seat across from him. So, he said, stirring his coffee lazily. Tell me what I need to know. Emma took out the letter and placed it on the table. Brooks raised an eyebrow, then picked it up and read. His expression didn't change, but Emma could see his mind working. After a long minute, he placed it down. Well, he said, this is interesting. Emma leaned forward. Can you find her son? Brooks sighed, running a hand over his beard. Maybe, he admitted. But I need more. Emma hesitated. Then she pulled out the photograph she had found in the library, the one of William and Eleanor, taken decades ago. Brooks studied it, then frowned. You said this woman was taken? Emma nodded. Brooks exhaled. This doesn't feel like a random disappearance, he muttered. It feels personal. Emma shivered. So, you'll help me? Brooks looked at her for a long moment. Then, he smirked. Let's find this kid. The first step was tracking down Eleanor's last known whereabouts. Brooks pulled old records, using his connections with ex-cops and city officials. It took a few days, but eventually, they found something. Eleanor's name appeared in a police report from 1983. She had been seen arguing with a man outside a hotel in Manhattan. A few days later, she was gone. And the man she had been arguing with, Gerald Whitmore, a wealthy businessman, connected, dangerous. Emma felt sick. Gerald Whitmore. He wasn't just some businessman. He had been a rival of William's back in the day. And now, he was the biggest clue in Eleanor's disappearance. Emma turned to Brooks. What do we do now? Brooks gave her a grim smile. We talked to the people who knew him. Their investigation led them to an old bartender who had worked at the hotel back in the 80s. The man was in his 70s now, living in a quiet nursing home. When Brooks and Emma visited, he sat in a worn-out chair, staring out the window. But when Brooks showed him Eleanor's photograph, his eyes widened. Eleanor, he whispered. Emma's pulse raced. You knew her. The old man nodded slowly. She used to come to the hotel a lot, he murmured, always looking over her shoulder. Always afraid. Emma's stomach twisted. What happened to her? She asked. The old man hesitated. Then he sighed. I remember the night she disappeared, he said. She came into the bar, shaken up, said she needed to get out of town fast. Emma held her breath. But before she could leave, the man continued. Gerald Whitmore showed up, took her by the arm, whispered something in her ear. Emma's hands clenched. What did he say? The bartender hesitated. Then his voice dropped to a whisper. He said, if you run, you'll never see your son again. Emma's blood ran cold. She had her baby already, she whispered. The old man nodded. She told me his names, he said. Emma leaned in. What was it? The man frowned as if searching his memory. Then, James, he said. James Whitmore. Emma froze. James Whitmore. He took his father's last name, which meant Eleanor's son was raised by the man who had taken her. Emma's heart pounded. Brooks let out a low whistle. Well, damn. That night, Emma sat alone in her room, her mind racing. Eleanor had been taken. Her son, James Whitmore, had been raised by the very man responsible. And William? He had never known the truth. Emma gritted her teeth. She had one goal now. Find James Whitmore. Tell him the truth about his mother, and make sure that William finally knew what really happened. Because one thing was certain. The past wasn't done with them yet. Emma sat in front of her laptop, staring at the name on the screen. James Whitmore. It had taken days of digging through records, with Brooks pulling every string he could. But now, they finally had something. James Whitmore was alive. And not just alive. He was powerful. At 40 years old, he was the CEO of Whitmore Enterprises, one of the biggest real estate development firms in New York. A self-made billionaire. Ruthless, respected, feared. And he hated William Harrington. Emma swallowed. How was she supposed to tell him the truth? That the man he despised wasn't the villain he thought he was. That his mother had loved William and had been taken away. Emma exhaled slowly. There was only one way to find out. She had to meet him. Getting into James Whitmore's world was not easy, Brooks warned her. "This guy doesn't take meetings with just anyone," he said, leaning against the hood of his car. "And he definitely won't talk about his past." Emma folded her arms. "I don't care," she said. "I have to try." Brooks sighed. "Well, good luck with that." He handed her a manila folder. "What's this?" "His schedule," Brooks said. "I pulled some strings. He's having a charity gala at the Whitmore Hotel tomorrow night." Emma's eyes widened. "That's perfect." Brooks cut her off with a laugh. "You're not on the guest list, sweetheart." Emma scowled. "Then I'll find a way in." The Whitmore Hotel was breathtaking. A massive glass structure towering over the city, with golden chandeliers and a marble-floored lobby that screamed money. Emma arrived dressed in borrowed elegance, a long black gown Eleanor had gifted her. She walked through the entrance with confidence, her heart pounding. Security guards checked names at the door. When it was her turn, she smiled at the man holding the guest list. "Emma Carter," she said smoothly. The guard frowned. "You're not on the list." Emma's stomach tightened. She had expected that, but she had one card left to play. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I work for William Harrington." The guard's expression changed immediately. A few guests turned to look. The name still carried weight. The man hesitated, then nodded. "You can go in." Emma exhaled slowly and stepped inside. The ballroom was stunning, a sea of tuxedos and silk gowns, crystal chandeliers casting warm golden light. Emma scanned the room, her breath catching when she saw him, James Whitmore. He stood near the center, speaking with investors, tall, broad shoulders, a commanding presence, and a coldness in his eyes. The same coldness she had once seen in William. Emma took a deep breath. Then she walked straight toward him. James was mid-conversation. When she stepped up, he turned, eyebrows raised. "Can I help you?" Emma's pulse raced. "My name is Emma Carter," she said. "I need to speak with you." "It's about your mother." James's expression froze. Then his eyes hardened. "I don't talk about my mother," he said. Emma refused to back down. "Then listen," she said. "Because you don't know the full story." James stared at her. Then, to her shock, he laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "This is cute," he said. "Did William Harrington send you?" Emma's stomach twisted. "No," she said. "I came on my own." "Because you need to know the truth." James's jaw clenched. "I already know the truth," he snapped. "William Harrington left my mother to die. He ruined her life." Emma shook her head. "That's not what happened." James's eyes burned with fury. "Get out." Emma's hands tightened into fists. She didn't have time for his anger. So she played her last card. She pulled out the letter. James's entire body went still. "What is that?" Emma held his gaze. "The letter your mother wrote before she disappeared," she said softly. For the first time, James looked uncertain. Emma stepped closer. "Please," she whispered. "Just read it." A long, tense silence. Then, James grabbed the letter and stormed out of the ballroom. Emma followed. James paced his private lounge, the letter clutched in his hands. Emma stood quietly watching as he read. As his eyes moved across the page, his expression changed. First, shock. Then, pain. Then, rage. He dropped the letter, his breathing uneven. "This is a lie," he muttered. "This can't be true." Emma stepped forward. "It is." James's fists clenched. "He never looked for her," he spat. "He just let her go." Emma hesitated. "He was told she had left willingly," she admitted. "But he should have fought harder." James's chest rose and fell sharply. For 40 years, he had lived with one belief, that his mother had been abandoned. And now, everything he had built, his hatred, his empire, it all felt hollow. James sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Emma's heart ached. "I know it's a lot," she said softly, "but you need to meet him." James's head snapped up. "What?" Emma held his gaze. "He's dying, James." James's breath hitched. She could see the war in his eyes. Then he stood. His voice was cold but quieter. "When?" Emma exhaled. "Tomorrow." A long silence. Then, finally, James nodded. And Emma knew. The truth had finally broken through. The morning air was crisp and tense as Emma waited outside the mansion's massive iron gates. She had barely slept. James Whitmore was coming. And after 40 years of hatred, today, he would finally face his father. Emma exhaled, tightening her coat. This meeting would change everything. She only hoped it wouldn't end in disaster. James hadn't called after reading the letter. He hadn't texted. Emma had waited in silence, unsure if he would actually show up. Then, just as she was about to lose hope, a black car pulled up. The door opened, and James stepped out. He was different now. The arrogant billionaire was gone. His face was pale, his shoulders stiff with tension. Emma's heart raced. "Are you sure you're ready?" she asked. James didn't answer. His blue eyes, so much like William's, just stared at the mansion. Then quietly, "Let's get this over with." Emma led him inside. The mansion was silent. Every footstep echoed against marble floors as they made their way to William's study. Emma glanced at James. His jaw was clenched, his breathing measured, as if he were preparing for war. She hesitated at the door. "James, I'm fine," he said. But his voice wasn't steady. Emma swallowed. Then she knocked. A voice, weak but clear, called out from inside. "Come in." Emma pushed the door open, and James stepped into the past. William was sitting by the window, his body frail, wrapped in a heavy robe. The light caught the silver in his hair, highlighting the deep lines on his face. When he turned, his entire body went still. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, "James?" The name was barely a whisper, as if William didn't believe it himself. James stared at him. For 40 years he had imagined this moment. He had thought he would feel anger, hatred, disgust. But now, looking at the man before him, all he felt was emptiness. "You look like her," William murmured. James flinched, his fingers curled into fists. "I don't need your sentiment," he snapped. "I just want the truth." William exhaled slowly. "I see," he said. "Then sit down." James hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he sat. The study was tense as William began speaking. He told James everything about his love for Eleanor, how they had planned a life together, only for her to disappear, how he had searched for years, believing she had abandoned him, how he had never known about his son. When he finished, the room was silent. James stared at him, his face unreadable. Then, "That's it," he said. "That's your excuse?" William's expression didn't change. "No," he said. "It's my failure." James's breath hitched. He had expected denial, excuses. Instead, William was admitting everything. For the first time in his entire life, James saw something in his father's eyes. Regret. James stood up suddenly, pushing back his chair. "I don't know what I expected," he muttered. Emma's heart pounded. "James!" He ignored her, turning to William. "I spent my entire life hating you," he said. "And now, you expect me to just forgive you?" William sighed heavily. "No," he said. "I don't expect anything." James stared at him, his hands shaking. Then, finally, he turned and walked out. Emma found James outside, leaning against his car. His shoulders were tense, his face pale. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood beside him. Finally, "I don't know what to do," James admitted. Emma looked at him. You don't have to decide today. James exhaled. Then softly, he's dying, isn't he? Emma nodded. James closed his eyes. Then, after a long moment, call me when he gets worse. And with that, he got in his car and drove away. The days that followed felt like a countdown. William's condition worsened rapidly. Emma watched as the once powerful man grew weaker with each passing hour. The doctor's visits became more frequent, the quiet moments more precious, and as the reality of his failing health settled in, Emma made the call to James. She didn't know if he would come, but he deserved the chance, and so did William. James arrived at dusk. The sky was painted in shades of fire, as if the world itself knew this was an ending. Emma was waiting at the door when he stepped out of his car. His expression was unreadable, but his hands were clenched into tight fists. Emma swallowed. He doesn't have much time. James didn't respond, but after a long moment, he nodded and followed her inside. The house was too quiet. Every step felt heavier, every breath more difficult. As they reached William's room, Emma turned to James. Are you sure you want to do this? She asked softly. James's jaw tightened. I don't know, he admitted, but he stepped forward anyway. Emma opened the door, and James walked inside. William was sitting by the window, wrapped in a blanket. The light caught his pale skin, his once sharp features now soft with exhaustion. He turned slowly, and when his blue eyes met James's, his breath caught. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, You came. James exhaled sharply. I almost didn't, he admitted. William gave a small, tired smile. I wouldn't have blamed you. The words hung heavy between them. Then quietly, I wish I had known about you. James's hands curled into fists. I don't know if that would have made a difference, he said stiffly. William's gaze didn't waver. But it would have made a difference to me. Silence. Then, I'm sorry, James. The words were simple, but they carried 40 years of regret. And James felt every one of them. James looked away, his emotions warring inside him. I hated you, he admitted. For a long time. William nodded slowly. I know. James let out a shaky breath. And then, for a long time, I thought that if I ever met you, I'd want to hurt you the way you hurt me. William didn't flinch. I wouldn't have stopped you. James stared at him. And in that moment, he saw the truth. This man, this tired, broken man, wasn't the monster he had imagined. He wasn't a villain. He was just a father who had lost too much. And James was his greatest loss. James sat down slowly. The anger, the bitterness, it didn't disappear. But something shifted. For the first time in his life, he wanted to know who William really was. And so they talked. About Eleanor. About what could have been. About what still could be. The hours passed in quiet conversation, until William's eyes grew heavy. Before he drifted into sleep, he reached out weakly. James hesitated. Then, he took his father's hand. For the first time, and the last, William Harrington passed away that night, peacefully, with his son by his side. When Emma found James in the morning, he was still sitting in the chair beside the bed. His expression was unreadable. Emma didn't say anything. She just placed a hand on his shoulder. After a long moment, James let out a shaky breath. I never got to ask him everything I wanted, he admitted. Emma swallowed hard. But you were here, she said. That's what matters. James nodded slowly. And for the first time, he believed it. 2 days later, Emma sat alone in William's study. In front of her was a sealed envelope, with her name on it. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, a letter, written in William's neat, deliberate handwriting. Emma took a deep breath and began to read. The weight of the letter in Emma's hands felt heavier than it should. She traced her fingers over William's signature, her heart pounding in her chest. He had written this knowing he wouldn't be around when she read it, knowing these words would be the last part of him she'd ever have. Emma took a slow, steadying breath and began to read. Emma, I don't know if you'll ever fully understand how much you've changed my life in such a short time. I was ready to leave this world alone, convinced that my legacy was nothing more than a series of regrets. But you reminded me that it's never too late to do something meaningful. You gave me a second chance to be someone better. You gave me hope, and for that, I will always be grateful. There are things I never told you, not because I wanted to keep secrets, but because I didn't know how to say them out loud. But now, with this letter, I want you to know the truth. You were never just an arrangement to me. From the moment you walked into my home, you brought life into a house that had been empty for too long. You reminded me what it meant to care for someone again, not as a business deal, not as a duty, but as family. Emma's vision blurred with tears. She forced herself to keep reading. I have one last request for you, Emma. It's not about money or inheritance. It's about purpose. I want you to take this house, this life I've built, and turn it into something that matters. I spent too many years hoarding wealth, chasing things that never truly fulfilled me. I don't want that for you. Take this place, take what I've left behind, and make it a home for those who need it most. A safe haven, a chance for second beginnings. That's my last wish, my only wish. And Emma, live boldly, love fiercely, never forget your worth. With gratitude, William Harrington. Emma pressed the letter to her chest, and for the first time since his passing, she let herself cry. The mansion felt different now, empty in a way that had nothing to do with space. The hallways were too quiet, the air too still. Emma found herself wandering from room to room, as if expecting to find William sitting in his study, reading a book. But he wasn't there, and he never would be again. In the music room, the piano sat untouched. Emma ran her fingers over the keys, remembering the nights they spent here. She pressed down softly. A single note rang out, filling the silence. She closed her eyes and played. A quiet, soft melody, not for herself, but for him. The days that followed were filled with legal discussions and estate matters. Lawyers, accountants, officials, each with a list of things that needed to be settled. Mr. Collins, the estate manager, sat across from her in the grand study. His hands folded neatly, his expression calm. You are now the legal owner of all William's assets, he said. Emma still wasn't used to hearing that. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. She thought back to William's letter. Turn it into something that matters. She had no doubt about what she had to do. I want to keep the house, she said finally. Collins raised an eyebrow. For yourself? Emma shook her head. No, she said. For them. The first thing Emma did was call James. She wasn't sure if he'd want to be involved, but he deserved to know. He listened silently as she explained her plan. When she finished, there was a long pause. Then quietly, I think he would have liked that, James said. And just like that, he was in. Emma's vision wasn't just an idea anymore. It was becoming real. She hired architects and contractors. She met with social workers and counselors. She wanted the mansion to be more than just a shelter. It would be a community, a place for families like hers, struggling, lost, on the brink of giving up. To find a second chance, the renovations began. The once quiet halls, echoed with the sound of hammers and saws. The walls that once held secrets and silence would now hold laughter and hope. Emma's mother, Linda, had been skeptical at first. "You're running an entire foundation now?" she asked, shaking her head in disbelief. Emma smiled. "I guess I am." Linda took her daughter's hands. Tears shimmered in her eyes. "I always knew you'd do something extraordinary." Emma swallowed the lump in her throat and hugged her mother tight. James had been quiet for weeks. Then, one afternoon, he showed up at the mansion with a box full of papers. Emma frowned. "What's this?" James exhaled. "I've been doing some research. If we're going to do this, we need funding. Grants, donors, partnerships." He looked up at her. "I want to help." Emma felt her throat tighten. She hadn't expected him to stay. But now, for the first time, he was choosing to be part of something bigger. Choosing to be part of William's legacy. Months later, the mansion was ready. The first family, a single mother and her 2 daughters, stood at the doorway looking around in awe. Emma knelt beside the youngest girl, who reminded her so much of Lily. "Welcome home," she whispered. The little girl's face lit up, and in that moment, Emma knew. She had done the right thing. She had kept her promise. She had honored William's final wish. And more than anything, she had found her purpose. That night, Emma stood outside the mansion, looking up at the sky. The stars burned bright, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. She whispered softly, "Thank you, William." And as the wind rustled through the trees, she almost swore. She heard his voice in the breeze. "Live boldly, love fiercely, never forget your worth." Emma smiled and walked inside, ready for whatever came next. The mansion was no longer just an estate. It had become something more, a place where people found hope again. Emma stood at the grand entrance, watching as the first families arrived. Mothers holding their children's hands, young adults who had nowhere else to go, people who had lost everything, now stepping into a new chapter of their lives. And she knew this was only the beginning. The renovation had taken months. Every inch of the mansion had been transformed. The grand ballroom, once a space for William's business gatherings, was now a communal dining area where people shared meals and stories. The upstairs wings, which had been filled with dust-covered rooms, were now warm, welcoming bedrooms for those in need. The music room, Emma's favorite place, had been left untouched. She couldn't bring herself to change it. Every time she walked in, she could still feel William's presence, and it comforted her. Running a foundation wasn't easy. Emma learned quickly that managing a home for struggling families was more than just offering shelter. She needed to provide job assistance, counseling services, educational programs, medical support, and most importantly, a safe environment where people could heal. James had become her right hand in making all of this work. "Emma," he said one afternoon, flipping through a stack of paperwork, "we have our first donor." Emma's eyes widened. "Who?" James slid the paper across the desk. She scanned the name and froze. It was from William, or rather, a charitable trust he had set up before he passed. His fortune wasn't just for Emma. It was for this, for the people who needed it most. Her chest tightened. Even after death, William was still taking care of them, taking care of her. One evening, as Emma was finalizing plans for an expansion project, she heard a knock on the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, a woman stood on the doorstep, mid-50s, elegant yet simple, and her eyes, they looked strangely familiar. "Can I help you?" Emma asked. The woman smiled softly. "My name is Eleanor." Emma's heart stopped. She had spent months searching for answers about William's past, about Eleanor Whitmore, and now she was standing right in front of her. Eleanor studied the grand estate before looking back at Emma. This was his home, wasn't it? Emma swallowed hard. She nodded. Yes. And now, it's a home for others. Eleanor exhaled, her shoulders relaxing. That sounds exactly like something he would do. Emma invited her in, and as they sat in the study, Eleanor told her everything. I loved William, Eleanor admitted, her voice heavy with emotion. We were young, foolish, and completely in love. Emma listened intently. He wanted to marry me, Eleanor continued, but his family, they didn't approve. Emma's heart sank. Because you weren't wealthy? Eleanor gave a small, sad smile. Because I wasn't from the world he belonged to. She looked down, her fingers tracing patterns on the armrest. I left because I thought it was best for him. I never wanted to hold him back. Emma felt a lump form in her throat. William never stopped loving her. And now, after all these years, she was finally here. Emma led Eleanor through the mansion, showed her the rooms, the families, the legacy William left behind. They ended their tour in the music room. Eleanor stepped inside and froze. Her eyes landed on the piano. Slowly she walked over, brushing her fingers over the keys. He used to play for me, she whispered. Emma sat beside her. He played for me too. A soft laugh. He never got any better, did he? Emma chuckled. No, but he never stopped trying. And for the first time that evening, Eleanor smiled. Before she left, Eleanor took Emma's hands. Thank you, she said, for giving him the peace he never had in life. Emma squeezed her hands in return. I think he did the same for me. Eleanor gave her a knowing look. Then we were both lucky, weren't we? Emma nodded. Yes, we were. And as Eleanor walked away, Emma knew she would never forget this moment. This was bigger than just her, bigger than William. It was a story of second chances, and she would make sure that no one else ever had to lose theirs. That night, Emma sat in the study, staring at the flickering candlelight. She opened William's final letter one last time and read his words again. Live boldly, love fiercely, never forget your worth. She smiled and whispered, I won't, William. The wind outside howled softly, as if answering her back. Emma closed the letter and prepared for the next chapter of her life, a life she never expected, but one she was now ready to embrace. The mansion was no longer just an estate. It was a beacon of hope for those who had nowhere else to turn. And for Emma, it was her life's purpose. She had spent the past months ensuring that every piece of William's vision, his legacy, was carried out exactly as he would have wanted. But there was still so much more to do. The mansion was alive in a way it had never been before. Children ran through the gardens, their laughter echoing through the estate. Volunteers and staff bustled about, ensuring that every detail was perfect for tonight's event. The first annual Harrington Foundation Gala. Emma had spent weeks planning this. Guest speakers, silent auction. To raise funds, a memorial tribute for William. And most importantly, a night to show the world what his generosity had created. But as she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her navy blue gown, her heart was pounding. Tonight wasn't just about the mansion. It was about her. Could she really do this? Was she ready to step into the spotlight? A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Come in. James stepped inside, looking sharp in a black tuxedo. You look like you're about to run. Emma let out a nervous laugh. Is it that obvious? He smirked. A little. He stepped closer, offering a reassuring smile. You've built something incredible here, Emma. William believed in you, And now, so do all these people out there. Emma took a deep breath. He was right. She wasn't just doing this for William anymore. She was doing it for herself, for her family, for every person who had been given a second chance. Because of this foundation, she lifted her chin and stepped into the night. The ballroom was packed. Philanthropists, community leaders, and donors filled the tables, engaged in quiet conversations. At the center of the room, beneath a massive crystal chandelier, was a grand stage, and behind it, a single framed photo of William. Emma took a deep breath as she stepped onto the stage. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the microphone. But when she looked at the crowd, she saw familiar faces, the families who had moved into the mansion, the children who had found safety here, the people who had been given a new chance at life. And suddenly, she wasn't afraid anymore. "Good evening, everyone," she began. Her voice, clear and steady, carried across the room. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight, for believing in this mission, for standing with us to make real change happen." She turned slightly, looking at William's photo. This place, this foundation, it was built by one man's vision, a man who, at first glance, seemed like just another billionaire, someone untouchable, someone distant. She paused, her throat tightening. But the William Harrington I knew, he wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just a name on a bank account. He was a man who had regrets, a man who wanted to make things right, a man who chose to use his wealth, not to buy more for himself, but to give everything away. And tonight, because of him, we are changing lives. A hush fell over the room. Emma took a deep breath. This mansion was once a symbol of loneliness, of a life filled with missed opportunities. But now, it is a home, a place of healing, a place where people find hope again. And that is what William left behind. Not just money, but a legacy. The applause was deafening. Emma felt the tears in her eyes. But for the first time, they weren't from sadness. They were from pride. She had done it. She had honored his memory. And now, it was time to take this mission even further. The gala was a massive success. Over $2 million was raised for the foundation. More families signed up for the program. More volunteers joined their mission. But the biggest surprise of the night? A private investor approached Emma, and his offer? To expand the foundation nationwide. She almost couldn't believe it. Could she really take this further? Turn William's legacy into something even greater? The answer was clear. Yes. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Emma found herself standing at William's gravesite. She placed a single white rose on the polished marble stone and traced her fingers over his name. "Hey, William," she whispered. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, making her smile. "I did it," she continued. "I kept my promise." She exhaled. "I think you'd be proud." For a long moment, she stood there, just letting the morning light wash over her. Then, she turned and walked away, not because she was leaving him behind, but because she was finally moving forward. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. The Harrington Foundation was no longer just an idea. It was a movement. Emma had spent the past year transforming the mansion into a safe haven for those in need. But now, it was time to think bigger. And that meant expanding nationwide. 2 weeks after the gala, Emma found herself sitting in a high-rise office in downtown Manhattan. The view stretched over the entire city, but her focus was on the man sitting across from her. Richard Langston, a billionaire investor, a man known for funding charitable organizations across the country. And right now, he was interested in her. I'll get straight to the point, Miss Carter, Richard said, leaning back in his chair. The work you've done with the Harrington Foundation is remarkable. You took one man's vision and turned it into something tangible, something that is already changing lives. Emma nodded, heart pounding. But, Richard continued, his gaze sharp, I believe it can be bigger. I want to offer you $50 million in funding to expand this foundation across the country. Emma's breath caught in her throat. 50 million? Richard smiled. It's an investment in the future. Oh, see, we could build centers in every major city, create scholarships, provide housing. You have the leadership. I have the resources. Emma's mind raced. This was beyond anything she had ever imagined. Could she really take this to the next level? Could she handle the pressure, the responsibility of something this massive? Then she thought of William, of his final words, live boldly. She looked up at Richard, her heart now steady. I'm in. Returning to the mansion, Emma wasted no time. She gathered her team, James, her closest confidant Mrs. Porter, who now oversaw operations, Daniel, the former private investigator turned security director, a team of lawyers, advisors, and financial planners. They had one goal: to turn the Harrington Foundation into a national movement. Meetings were held, contracts were signed, blueprints for new centers were drawn up. Emma barely had time to breathe. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was building something greater than herself. One evening, as Emma was reviewing expansion plans, a knock echoed through the office door. Come in, she called without looking up. When the door opened, her eyes widened. Jake, her brother, now 14 years old, standing taller than she remembered, his eyes filled with something different, something softer. Hey, Em, he said, stepping inside. Emma stood quickly. Jake? What are you doing here? He hesitated, shifting on his feet. I wanted to see you, see this place, and, he swallowed hard. I wanted to say thank you. Emma felt her heart stop. Jake had always been the tough one, the kid who never said how he felt. And now, he was standing here in front of her, acknowledging everything she had done. You saved us, he continued. I never said it before, but I see it now. You didn't have to do all this, Em. You could have left. You could have walked away. But you didn't. His voice cracked slightly. You gave us a home. Tears blurred Emma's vision. She stepped forward and pulled him into a tight hug. You were always my home, Jake, she whispered. You and Lily and Mom. I just wanted to make sure you had a chance. Jake held on a little longer before stepping back, clearing his throat. Mom's doing good, by the way, he said. She's getting better every day. And Lily? She's a little artist now, drawing all over the walls at home. Emma laughed, wiping her eyes. I'll have to see those masterpieces soon. Jake grinned. Yeah, and maybe I could help out here. I mean, if you need someone to, I don't know, do stuff. Emma's heart swelled. You'd really want that? He nodded, shoving his hands in his pockets. I think I'd like to be part of this. She smiled. Then welcome to the team, Jake. As the weeks passed, Emma realized expansion wasn't easy. There were barriers, bureaucratic red tape slowing things down, corrupt officials demanding bribes to approve building permits, people who didn't believe in her vision. For every victory there was a setback, but Emma refused to give up. She leaned on her team, on her own strength, and most of all, on the promise she made to William. This wasn't just about honoring him anymore. It was about the future, for her family, for the people who needed it most. And no matter how hard it got, She would never stop fighting. The first 5 Harrington centers opened across the country: Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, Houston, Atlanta. Thousands of families found safety. Hundreds of students received scholarships. The foundation had become a national success. And Emma? She had become more than just the executor of William's will. She had become a leader, a force of change, and for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. One evening, Emma was in the study, going through old records, when she found it. A letter, hidden in the back of a locked drawer in William's desk. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. And when she began reading, her breath caught. If you're reading this, it means you have done exactly what I always knew you would. You have taken this foundation and turned it into something extraordinary. I never doubted you, Emma. Not for a second. You have a strength inside you that most people never find in a lifetime. And I hope, more than anything, that you see it now. Because you deserve everything, Emma. Not just this foundation, not just success. You deserve happiness, love, a life of your own choosing. I don't know where the road will take you next, but I do know this. Wherever you go, whatever you do, you will change lives. And I couldn't be prouder. With all my heart, Emma pressed the letter to her chest, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. And in that moment, she knew. This was only the beginning. Emma stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, watching the Harrington Legacy Gala unfold before her eyes. It had been 2 years since she first stepped into this mansion. 2 years since she had signed that contract. 2 years since her life had changed forever. And tonight, it was all coming full circle. The Harrington Foundation's annual gala had become one of the most anticipated events in New York City. A celebration of impact, a testament to everything Emma and her team had built. The ballroom sparkled with elegant chandeliers, and guests, business leaders, philanthropists, community members, mingled over champagne and laughter. But this wasn't just a charity event. It was a reminder that one man's final wish had turned into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. And tonight, Emma had one last gift to unveil. Miss Carter, we're ready for you. Emma turned to see James, her closest advisor, standing beside her. He looked sharp in his tuxedo, his expression calm but expectant. You okay? He asked. Emma nodded, though her heart was pounding. Yeah, just thinking. About what? She exhaled, glancing around the room. About William. About the girl she used to be. About the woman she had become. A lot of things, she admitted with a small smile. James smirked. Well, don't think too hard. You've got a speech to give. Emma laughed softly, then squared her shoulders. Let's do this. As Emma stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Hundreds of faces turned toward her, waiting. She took a deep breath, then began. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. This gala isn't just about fundraising. It's about something bigger. It's about legacy. Her voice was strong, steady. 2 years ago, I met a man who changed my life. William Harrington was not just a billionaire. He was a man who had made mistakes, a man who had regrets. But more than anything, he was a man who believed in second chances. She paused, letting the words sink in. He gave me a chance when I had nothing. And because of him, we are here tonight, celebrating the thousands of lives we've changed together. Applause erupted. Emma waited, then continued. But tonight isn't just about looking back. It's about moving forward. She turned to the massive screen behind her. Because starting next year, the Harrington Foundation will be expanding into 10 new cities. Gasps of excitement rippled through the crowd. Emma smiled. She had one more surprise. And there's one more thing. The screen flickered, revealing an architectural rendering of a new facility. We are proud to announce the construction of the William Harrington Medical Center, a state-of-the-art hospital that will provide free health care to underprivileged families across the country. The crowd exploded into cheers. Tears welled in Emma's eyes. This was more than just a building. It was his final gift to the world. Later that night, after the gala had ended, Emma found herself standing in the Harrington Library. The room was quiet now, just her, and a single candle flickering beside a framed photograph picture of William. She reached into her pocket, pulling out his final letter, now worn from being read so many times. She traced the words once more. Then, in a whisper, she said, "I hope I made you proud, William." The candle's flame flickered. As if answering, Emma smiled softly, and for the first time in her life, she felt at peace. 1 year later, the Harrington Medical Center opened its doors. Over 50,000 people received free medical care. The foundation expanded nationwide. Emma's family thrived. Her mother healthy, Jake in college, Lily dreaming big. And Emma, she stood before a new challenge, a new dream, a new beginning, because this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Life is unpredictable. One moment, you're struggling to survive, and the next, you're building something greater than yourself. Emma's journey wasn't just about survival. It was about finding purpose, love, and the courage to create change. But what about you? If you were in Emma's shoes, would you have made the same choices? Tell us in the comments. What part of this story moved you the most? Did you feel the weight of Emma's sacrifice? Were you inspired by William's final act of redemption? Or was there a moment that hit you right in the heart? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this journey, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Because next time, we have something even more powerful waiting for you. A story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about fate, love, and second chances. Stay tuned. Movie magic.